London, 1849. The night was thick with fog that curled along the cobbled streets like whispered secrets, and inside the grand drawing-room of Ashford House, a life was being traded like coin across a gaming table. Lady Eleanor Ashford, only 19, stood at the far end of the chamber, her slender hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles whitened beneath her pale skin. Her father, Baron Ashford, paced like a desperate man who knew his house was falling, brick by brick, into ruin. Opposite him, seated with an air of immovable power, was Damien Blackwood, the Duke of Aylesford, a man known throughout London for his wealth, his influence, and his chilling indifference to all things that smacked of sentiment. The agreement lay on the table between them, written in an elegant script that looked almost mocking in its neatness. Eleanor had read the terms once and did not wish to read them again, for they carved her fate with cruel precision. She would become the Duchess of Aylesford, but not as a wife in truth. Damien had no interest in companionship, affection, or the tender comforts of marriage. She was to be, in his exact words, a wife for show. A polished jewel to set on his arm at state dinners, a name to quiet society's whispers that the Duke, at 32, had remained unmarried for too long. Eleanor's heart burned at the phrase, just for show. It stripped her of personhood, reducing her to ornament. She glanced at Damien then, studying the man whose life would become entwined with hers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair catching the candlelight, his storm-grey eyes sharp as steel. He was not ugly, nor cruel in feature, but his expression carried a severity that chilled the room. Every line of his body spoke of command and distance, as if emotions were weaknesses long buried and forgotten. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts, heavy with pleading. "You see, Eleanor, this is for the good of our family. The Duke is offering salvation. Debts cleared, estates secured." "You will be secure, child, a duchess." He said the word as though it were a crown of gold, but Eleanor did not crave crowns, nor security purchased by the loss of her heart. She had grown up with stories of her mother's gentle marriage, of love that bloomed in quiet gardens and soft laughter at twilight. To stand now, treated as a pawn in a bargain between men, stung bitterly. Still she lifted her chin, meeting Damien's gaze with a strength she did not feel. "And what of me, your Grace?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "What am I to you beyond this arrangement?" Damien leaned back, the faintest flicker of something, irritation, or perhaps admiration, passing across his face before vanishing. His tone was smooth, precise, utterly without warmth. "You are suitable, well-bred enough to silence criticism, pleasing enough to the eye that society will accept you. Beyond that, my lady, nothing is required. You will have gowns, jewels, the finest carriages. You will host as I command and smile when I require it. Our marriage will be efficient." The words cut deeper than any raised voice could have done. Efficient, suitable, for show. Each one drove into Eleanor's chest like a pin, fastening her into a cage she could not escape. Yet pride rose stubbornly within her. She would not weep in front of him, nor allow him to see her despair. "If that is the bargain," she said quietly, "then I will uphold my part. But do not mistake silence for submission, your Grace. A woman may be dressed as a jewel, but she remains a soul beneath the setting." A flicker again, this time unmistakable, darkened Damien's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even respect, though it was quickly buried. "We understand one another then," he replied, rising to his full height. He gathered the contract, signed in her father's trembling hand, and slid it into his coat. "The announcement will be made tomorrow. Prepare yourself, Lady Eleanor. You will be a duchess, whether you welcome the title or not. When he left, the echo of his boots fading into the night, Eleanor stood, frozen in the silence. Her father, exhausted, muttered thanks to Providence and sank into a chair. But she did not move. The weight of her new life pressed down on her shoulders, heavy as chains. She was to be Damien Blackwood's wife. Not loved, not cherished, but displayed like silver on a banquet table. And yet, as the candles guttered low, Eleanor's eyes did not glisten with tears. Instead, a fierce resolve glowed in their green depths. If she was to be only for show, then she would be the brightest jewel society had ever seen. She would not be broken. And perhaps one day she might force even the cold Duke of Aylesford to see her not as an ornament, but as a woman of worth. The announcement of Lady Eleanor Ashford's engagement to Damien Blackwood, Duke of Aylesford, swept through London like fire through dry hay. Society had long whispered about the Duke's refusal to wed, about his disdain for sentimental ties, and now they gossiped with renewed vigour. Some pitied the young baron's daughter who had been chosen, others envied her sudden elevation. But all agreed on one thing: the Duke had married not for love, but for convenience. The whispers grew sharper when Eleanor, barely 19, entered Aylesford Abbey as his duchess. The abbey itself seemed designed to crush a spirit unused to its weight. Its sprawling stone walls stretched toward the sky, severe and unyielding, with towers that caught the mist and cast it down in sheets of grey. Within, the corridors echoed with her footsteps, the vaulted ceilings looming like watchful sentinels. Servants bowed deeply when she passed, yet their eyes darted, measuring this new mistress who had arrived not through affection but through arrangement. Eleanor felt the scrutiny keenly but raised her head, determined not to falter. Husband did not make her task easier. Damien greeted her at the grand doors with the courtesy one might afford a guest rather than a wife. He offered his arm, escorted her through the marble-floored hall, and presented her chambers on the east wing. Richly furnished, yes, but far from his own. "You will find these accommodations sufficient," he said coolly, his storm-grey eyes devoid of warmth. "If you require anything, inform the housekeeper. We will dine together when custom demands, otherwise you are free to amuse yourself as you please." Amuse herself. The words stung, though Eleanor smiled politely, as though the thought of loneliness were no heavier than lace upon her shoulders. Once the door closed, she let out a breath and looked around. Her chamber was indeed magnificent, a canopy bed draped in velvet, gilded mirrors that reflected her weary face, French windows opening onto manicured gardens. Yet all the beauty felt cold, like jewels locked in a case. She was not mistress here, she was ornament, carefully placed but untouched. Her new life unfurled quickly into ritual. By day, Eleanor played her part at luncheons and afternoon calls, dressed in gowns chosen by Damien's steward, her hair styled with mechanical perfection by a maid who barely spoke. By night, she accompanied her husband to dinners where he introduced her with pride in her beauty, but none in her being. His words were smooth, his smile practiced, but when they returned to the abbey, the silence between them stretched like a gulf. He would retire to his study, leaving her to her chambers and her thoughts. London's society, however, was enraptured. Whispers reached Eleanor's ears at every gathering. "She's very pretty, isn't she? Almost doll-like. The Duke finally married, but don't be deceived, she's only for display." The poor girl, locked in a gilded cage, some spoke with cruelty, others with pity, but all saw her as nothing more than a decorative duchess. And yet Eleanor refused to crumble. When she stood at Damien's side, her emerald eyes did not lower with shame. She listened keenly to conversation, offering measured remarks that surprised more than one guest. "Ah, so the new Duchess has a mind behind her smile," one lord murmured, half admiring, half mocking. Eleanor caught the words and tucked them close, a small victory. She found other small rebellions. In the mornings, when the Duke remained locked in his study, Eleanor wandered the gardens, speaking kindly to the gardeners who bowed with astonishment. She visited the kitchens, praising the cook's skill, earning shy smiles where once there had been wary silence. Slowly, quietly, she carved out a space that was her own, not given by her husband, but claimed by her resolve. Still the nights weighed heavy. Eleanor would sit at her window, the moonlight silvering her auburn curls, and wonder what life might have been had love chosen her instead of duty. She longed for laughter, for a hand to clasp hers, not out of obligation, but out of devotion. And sometimes, when she glimpsed Damien across a ballroom, tall and commanding, his presence drawing every eye, she wondered if even he, so cold, so rigid, ever felt the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. One evening, as they prepared to attend a grand supper in London, Damien entered her chamber unannounced. Eleanor, fastening a necklace at her throat, startled. His eyes swept over her sapphire gown, lingering a moment too long before he masked his gaze. "You look suitable," he said at last. The word was meant as praise, but it struck her heart like a dull blade. She forced a smile, though her voice trembled. "I was not aware, Your Grace, that I was chosen to be suitable. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, to be seen." For the first time, Damien faltered. His expression hardened almost instantly, but Eleanor had caught the flicker of something. Discomfort, perhaps even guilt. He turned away, adjusting his cufflinks. "We must leave. The carriage waits." As they descended the Abbey's grand staircase, Eleanor held her head high. If she was destined to be a duchess only for show, then she would play the part flawlessly. But deep within her a question had taken root. Stubborn and unyielding, how long could a man live beside a woman who refused to remain invisible? The weeks that followed blurred into a pattern of duty and silence. To the outside world, Eleanor Ashford appeared every inch the Duchess of Aylesford. A vision of grace, draped in satin and pearls, her smile as polished as the diamonds that glittered at her throat. She sat at Damien's side during dinners, greeted visiting lords and ladies with courtesy, and accepted the endless curtsies of servants. From a distance, her life seemed enviable, almost charmed. But behind the smile lay a loneliness that grew heavier with each passing day. Her chambers, though resplendent with velvet curtains and gilded mirrors, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Each night, when Damien retreated to his study or disappeared into the darkened halls of the Abbey, Eleanor would sit at her writing desk by candlelight, penning letters she never sent. Letters to her late mother, to a future self she could not yet imagine, even to a God she was not certain still listened. Her words spilled with longing. "I am seen by everyone, yet known by no one. How can a heart remain whole when it beats unheard?" By day, she carried her role with dignity. Her father's warning echoed in her mind, "Bear it well, child. You are our salvation." She did not wish to see the shame in his eyes, should she falter. So Eleanor walked with her chin high, her green eyes bright, her voice calm. When people whispered Duchess for show, she smiled all the more sweetly, as if the words had no sting. Yet every smile cost her a piece of herself. There were rare moments when her loneliness eased. In the Abbey's sprawling gardens, Eleanor discovered a small glass conservatory hidden among rose hedges, its panes dusted with neglect. With the housekeeper's hesitant permission, she set about reviving it. Day by day she coaxed life back into the plants. Roses unfurled in scarlet and ivory, jasmine crept along trellises, orchids bloomed in delicate colours. Within that quiet glass house, Eleanor found a measure of peace. Here, she was not an ornament. She was a gardener, a caretaker, a woman shaping beauty with her own hands. Sometimes she caught Damien watching her from a distance as she worked, his expression unreadable. He never joined her, never spoke, but she felt his gaze. It unsettled her, not because it was cruel, but because it hinted at something he fought to keep hidden. Yet as soon as she turned, he was gone, leaving her to wonder if she had only imagined it. Loneliness was most cruel during the grand events of London. At glittering banquets and candlelit balls, Eleanor stood on Damien's arm like a polished statue. He introduced her with cold precision. "My wife, the Duchess of Aylesford." The words carried no affection, only possession. Still she played her role flawlessly. She laughed at the right moments, curtsied with perfect grace, and dazzled with gowns that drew envious stares. But when the music swelled and couples danced, Damien would remain at the edge of the floor, refusing to lead her. More than once, Eleanor stood among the crowd, a duchess without a partner, her heart aching as she watched other women whirl in their husbands' arms. In those moments, she questioned whether she had become invisible not only to her husband but to herself. What am I, if not a wife? If not a partner? Do I exist only as a reflection of his title? The questions haunted her like shadows. Her loneliness did not go unnoticed by society. Some whispered with pity, others with cruelty. Lady Margaret Fairchild, a sharp-tongued socialite, once remarked loudly within Eleanor's hearing, "The poor girl smiles so prettily, but one can see her eyes are hollow. The Duke married a portrait, not a person." Laughter rippled through the drawing-room. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she lifted her glass calmly and sipped, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of seeing her wound. That night, however, in the privacy of her chamber, she wept into her pillow until sleep claimed her. Yet Eleanor was not a woman who broke easily. Beneath the silk and lace beat a heart of quiet defiance. She found ways to carve meaning into her days. She visited the village school, bringing books and supplies, earning the gratitude of mothers who curtsied deeply when she passed. She began hosting small teas for the wives of lesser nobles, women often overlooked by society's grand dames. In her company, they laughed freely, finding in her a duchess who treated them as equals. These small acts of kindness gave Eleanor a sense of purpose. She was determined not to let her life be reduced to glitter and emptiness. At times she wondered if Damien noticed. If he did, he gave no sign. He remained an enigma, cold, disciplined, untouchable. And yet, in fleeting moments, the brush of his gaze, the faintest hesitation in his voice, Eleanor sensed a storm beneath his calm surface. She wondered if loneliness lived in his heart too, cloaked beneath pride and scars invisible to the world. One evening, as the moon cast silver light across the Abbey gardens, Eleanor stood alone in her conservatory, surrounded by the fragrance of roses. She pressed a hand to the glass, staring into the night, and whispered to herself, "I may be only for show, but I will not vanish. I will not." Her voice trembled but carried strength. Somewhere deep inside, she believed her life would not always be so hollow. Somewhere she believed a change must come, though she could not yet see how. Spring in London always brought with it a flurry of soirees, luncheons, and musical evenings, and the Duchess of Aylesford, though barely a few months married, was expected to grace them all. At first, Eleanor attended with the same quiet resignation, that had marked her early days at the Abbey, a dutiful presence on Damien's arm, her smiles carefully measured, her words kept modest. Yet something within her had begun to shift. Perhaps it was the strength she had drawn from her glass house of roses, or the gratitude of the village mothers she had quietly aided. Perhaps it was simply that she had grown weary of being dismissed as an ornament. Whatever the reason, Eleanor began to step into her role, not merely as a duchess for show, but as a woman determined to leave her mark. Her chance came at Lady Ashworth's Spring Music Hall. The salon was crowded with London's finest, glittering with jewels and perfumed with roses. Eleanor entered on Damien's arm, her emerald silk gown shimmering beneath the chandeliers, her auburn curls pinned with tiny pearls. At once, the familiar whispers stirred. There she is, the decorative duchess. So very pretty, but does she ever speak? This time, however, Eleanor did not merely stand and smile. When Lady Ashworth invited guests to discuss the evening's poetry recital, Eleanor surprised the room with a thoughtful observation on Wordsworth's verses, speaking gently but with conviction. The room fell into a hush before murmurs of astonishment swept through it. "Ah, the Duchess has wit," someone remarked. More than a painted smile, it seems. Lady Ashworth, herself taken aback, clapped her hands with delight. Indeed, how refreshing to hear a young woman speak with both charm and intelligence. For the first time, admiration, rather than pity, rippled through the assembly. Men and women leaned toward Eleanor, eager to hear more. She spoke modestly, offering her thoughts without arrogance, and in doing so she revealed a mind that few had suspected existed beneath the diamonds and silks. Even Damien, who had stood impassive at her side, glanced down at her with the faintest flicker of surprise in his storm-grey eyes. But it was another man who noticed most keenly, Viscount Nathaniel Harrow, a childhood acquaintance of Eleanor's family. Tall, handsome, with a smile that carried warmth instead of chill, Nathaniel approached after the recital with a bow. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the ease of old familiarity, "you have grown into a woman of remarkable grace. I had feared London would swallow your spirit, but I see now it shines brighter than ever." His words, spoken without mockery, sent a flush to Eleanor's cheeks. It had been so long since anyone addressed her as though she were more than a title. Damien's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, though he offered no comment. Nathaniel, sensing nothing, continued with unguarded warmth. "I would be honoured, Duchess, if you would allow me the next dance." The room stirred with interest. Rarely had Eleanor been seen on a dance floor, for Damien never partnered her. Yet here was a viscount, bowing low, inviting her as though she were the belle of the ball. Eleanor hesitated, glancing at her husband. Damien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Go," his silence seemed to declare. "Play your part." And so she did. Nathaniel led her to the floor as the musicians struck up a waltz. Eleanor's heart pounded, but the Viscount's gentle confidence steadied her. As they moved across the polished floor, guests gasped at the sight. The Duchess of Aylesford gliding with grace, her laughter soft and genuine for the first time since her marriage. Admiration filled the air. "How radiant she looks," whispered one lady. "Perhaps the Duke has underestimated his wife." From the edge of the room, Damien watched like a hawk. His eyes never left her, though his face remained carved from stone. To those who did not know him, he seemed unaffected, but Eleanor, glancing once toward him, saw the storm gathering beneath his calm surface. His hand clenched around his glass, his shoulders stiffened. Jealousy, the very emotion he had sworn never to feel, flickered in his gaze. When the dance ended, Nathaniel bowed low. "You have lost nothing of your light, Lady Eleanor. In truth, you have only gained more." Eleanor thanked him quietly, her cheeks warm, her heart uncertain. She had enjoyed the dance, yes, but more than that, she had tasted what it felt like to be truly seen. Damien stepped forward then, reclaiming her arm with quiet finality. His voice was smooth, yet edged with steel. "My wife grows more accomplished each day, but we must not monopolize her time, Viscount." His words were polite, but his grip on Eleanor's arm betrayed the tension coiled within him. As the evening wore on, whispers filled the salons. Some admired the Duchess anew, others speculated on the Duke's reaction. Did you see the way he watched her? Perhaps the cold Duke is not so impervious after all. Eleanor heard the murmurs but kept her composure, her smile serene. Yet inside, her heart beat with a new, unsteady rhythm. Something had shifted tonight. Society had begun to see her not as a mere decoration, but as a woman with wit, grace, and charm of her own. And Damien, though he might deny it, had begun to see her too, not with indifference, but with something far more dangerous. Damien Blackwood had long prided himself on mastery. Mastery over his estates, his reputation, his business dealings, even over his own emotions. In a world where weakness was exploited and vulnerability invited ruin, he had learned early to steel himself against both. Yet after Lady Ashworth's musicale, he found that mastery slipping like sand through his fingers. He had expected his new Duchess to be dutiful, compliant, silent, a jewel to display, a mask to wear at society's tedious gatherings. But Eleanor had surprised him, and Damien Blackwood, Duke of Aylesford, despised being surprised. The image of her on the dance floor with Nathaniel Harrow haunted him for nights afterward. He had stood at the edge of the room, his glass untouched in his hand, watching as she moved with effortless grace. Her laughter, soft, genuine, unforced, rang in his ears long after the music ended. It was not the empty laughter she employed at dull dinner parties, nor the polite chuckles she reserved for strangers. This had been real, and it had been for another man. That truth gnawed at Damien in a way he could not name. He told himself it was pride, nothing more. His Duchess was his possession, and possessions were not meant to be admired by others. He convinced himself that it was his reputation at stake, that whispers of her warmth toward Harrow could tarnish his carefully constructed image. Yet deep in the recesses of his guarded heart, Damien knew the truth was more perilous. He did not like that Eleanor's smile, the smile he had dismissed as merely suitable, had bloomed so fully in another man's company. In the days that followed, Damien found himself watching her more closely. At dinners, he noted how her emerald eyes sparkled when she spoke of books or gardens. At teas, he observed the way she leaned in attentively to listen to a dowager's woes, offering kindness where most offered only indifference. At the Abbey, he noticed the quiet strength with which she carried herself, transforming a house of cold marble into a home where servants now met her gaze with something nearing affection. She was not the ornamental Duchess he had believed her to be. She was something far more dangerous, a woman who could command admiration, who could inspire loyalty, who could, if he let her, claim his very heart. That thought unsettled him more than her dance with Harrow. Damien had vowed never again to love. Love was a weakness, a chink in armor, and he had locked that part of himself away long ago, after betrayal had left scars one could see. His marriage to Eleanor had been a bargain, nothing more. She was meant to be a shield against gossip, a polished figure for display. Yet each time he caught her laughing with the gardeners, or speaking with conviction at a gathering, He felt his resolve falter. It did not help that Nathaniel Harrow's attentions grew bolder. The Viscount seemed ever present at society's functions, quick with compliments, and eager to engage Eleanor in conversation. Damien told himself he did not care, that her reputation was her own to guard. But when he saw Harrow lean too close at a supper party, his hand hovering as though to brush Eleanor's arm, Damien's blood boiled with an unfamiliar fire. Later that evening, when they returned to Aylesford Abbey, he dismissed the servants and confronted Eleanor in the drawing-room. "You caught whispers," he said coldly, his storm-grey eyes fixed on hers. "Do you enjoy making a spectacle?" Eleanor, seated gracefully on a settee, looked up at him without flinching. "If I am a spectacle, it is because you placed me upon the stage, Your Grace. I did not ask for the part." Her words struck sharper than he expected. For a moment, Damien felt his composure slip. He wanted to tell her to be careful, that Harrow's attentions were not harmless, that the world was crueler than she imagined. But the words tangled in his throat, replaced instead by the armor of pride. "You are my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Remember that." Eleanor rose, her chin lifting in quiet defiance. "Indeed I am, but I am not your shadow, nor your puppet. If you wish for silence, then perhaps you should have married a portrait." The retort left Damien momentarily speechless. He had expected tears or meekness, not fire. And in that fire he saw the truth of her, a woman far too alive to remain a decoration. For the first time he felt a dangerous pull toward her, a pull that threatened the vow he had guarded for so long. That night, long after Eleanor had retired, Damien sat alone in his study, staring into the flames of the hearth, jealousy, pride, desire, all warred within him. He could not decide which unsettled him more, that others admired her, or that he was beginning to admire her himself. The season reached its height with the Duchess of Pembroke's midsummer ball, a glittering spectacle of gilded chandeliers, silk-draped walls, and music that pulsed like the very heartbeat of London. Nobility from across the country crowded into the vast ballroom, their laughter and gossip weaving beneath the strains of violins. For Eleanor, the night felt heavy with expectation. She had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her, yet she also knew that every gathering now carried a new tension, one sparked by Nathaniel Harrow's attentions and her husband's silent watchfulness. As she descended the grand staircase on Damien's arm, her gown of ivory and silver shimmering in the candlelight, heads turned. There she is. The Duchess who has surprised us all. The Duchess who danced with another man. Eleanor heard the murmurs but held her chin high, her emerald eyes calm, her smile serene. If society demanded a performance, she would give them one, but on her own terms. Damien, tall and severe at her side, betrayed no emotion. His face was carved into a mask of indifference, yet beneath the marble exterior a storm raged. He had told himself he would not let Harrow provoke him, that Eleanor's behaviour was beyond his concern. But as the Viscount approached, bowing low before Eleanor, with a smile that carried more warmth than courtesy, Damien's chest tightened with something he could not name. "Your Grace," Harrow said smoothly, his gaze lingering upon Eleanor. "You are radiant tonight. The stars themselves pale beside you?" Eleanor inclined her head politely, though she flushed at the boldness of the compliment. "You are kind, my lord." Damien's jaw clenched. He said nothing, yet the silence was louder than any words. Harrow, emboldened, extended a hand. "Might I have the honour of this dance?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet. Guests nearby stilled, their curiosity sharpened. All eyes turned to the Duke of Aylesford, waiting to see if the cold husband would once again refuse his wife the courtesy of a dance. Eleanor hesitated, her heart thudding. She glanced at Damien, who stared at Harrow with eyes like steel. For a moment she thought he would walk away, leaving her to accept. But then, to her astonishment, Damien spoke. "No," he said, his voice low but carrying through the hushed crowd. "She will dance with me." Gasps rippled through the room. The Duke of Aylesford, notorious for shunning the dance floor, had claimed his wife publicly at last. Eleanor herself stood frozen, scarcely believing what she had heard. Harrow's smile faltered, but he bowed with practiced grace. "Of course, Your Grace, I would not presume." Without waiting for Eleanor's reply, Damien took her hand and led her onto the floor. His grip was firm, almost possessive, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The musician struck up a waltz, and together they began to move. At first, Eleanor was stiff in his arms, uncertain of his sudden claim. But Damien guided her with surprising skill, his movements precise, his posture commanding. Around them, whispers erupted. "Look at them, how striking they are together." The Duke dances at last. Perhaps he is not so cold after all. Eleanor's mind swirled. What did this mean? Why now? She dared to lift her gaze to his. His storm-grey eyes were no longer blank, but alive with a fierce light. "You should be more cautious with Harrow," he said quietly, his voice for her ears alone. "He is not what he seems." "Then perhaps you should warn me rather than stand in silence," she replied, her tone soft but edged with defiance. His lips tightened. "I warned you tonight." They spun across the floor, their bodies closer than they had ever been, the heat of his presence burning through the thin barrier of silk and wool. Eleanor's heart raced, not merely from the dance, but from the unfamiliar sensation of belonging in his arms, even if only for a moment. She hated that part of her thrilled at his jealousy, that a small, secret voice whispered, "At last, he sees you." When the music ended, Damien did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he drew her closer, his eyes lingering on hers with an intensity that set her blood aflame. Then, as though realizing the risk of what he revealed, he stepped back, his mask sliding swiftly into place. "You did well," he said curtly, before leading her from the floor. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Did you see the way he looked at her? The cold Duke jealous? Impossible. Perhaps their marriage is not so hollow after all. Eleanor heard every word, though she dared not let her expression change. Inside, however, her heart beat with a dangerous rhythm. She had glimpsed something in Damien tonight, a crack in his fortress of indifference, a fire he could not fully hide. Later, as she sat alone in her chamber, Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips, remembering the heat of his gaze, the strength of his hand at her back. She whispered into the darkness, if jealousy can awaken him, what else might lie hidden beneath that armor? The midsummer ball had altered something fundamental between them. Though Damien returned to his familiar silence in the days that followed, Eleanor could feel the shift like an invisible current running through the Abbey's halls. His eyes lingered on her more often, his voice grew sharper when another man praised her too freely, and his presence seemed to shadow her wherever she went. For Eleanor, who had endured months of indifference, the sudden spark of jealousy was both intoxicating and perilous. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself it was unwise to encourage his moods, that Damien's pride was a fortress too high to breach. Yet the memory of their waltz clung to her, the heat of his hand at her back, the fire in his gaze. For the first time, she had felt not like an ornament, but like a woman who mattered, That taste of recognition stirred something reckless within her. If jealousy was the key that loosened his armor, then perhaps she could use it to reveal the man beneath. It began innocently. At a tea hosted by Lady Worthington, Eleanor accepted Nathaniel Harrow's compliments with more warmth than she once might have shown. When he remarked on her knowledge of Greek history, she laughed lightly, meeting his gaze as though genuinely pleased. From the corner of the room, Damien's eyes burned into her, though he said nothing. Later, during their carriage ride home, silence stretched taut between them. His gloved hands rested stiffly on his knees, his jaw clenched. At last he muttered, "You seem to enjoy Harrow's attention." Eleanor lifted her chin, her voice calm but deliberate. "He speaks to me as though I have a mind worth hearing. Can you say the same, Your Grace?" The question cut, and Damien's silence deepened. But in his storm-grey eyes, Eleanor glimpsed something more than anger. She saw hurt, swiftly buried. Encouraged, she continued her game in small, careful measures. She lingered a moment longer in conversation with young lords, allowed her laughter to ring just loud enough for Damien to hear, and carried herself with a poise that demanded admiration. Each time she caught the tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze darkened, the faint edge in his voice. And each time her heart thrilled at the power it gave her. Yet the game was dangerous. At Lady Pembroke's garden party, the tension between them nearly cracked into open conflict. Eleanor, radiant in pale blue silk, had accepted Harrow's arm for a walk among the roses. They spoke of books, of her efforts to revive the conservatory at Aylesford, of memories of summers long past. Nathaniel's warmth was genuine, his admiration unfeigned. For a brief moment, Eleanor allowed herself to bask in it, forgetting the eyes upon her. But Damien did not forget. He appeared suddenly at her side, his voice cold enough to frost the summer air. "Harrow, I believe my wife has had sufficient company. You will excuse us." The Viscount stiffened but bowed politely. "Of course, Your Grace." As Harrow withdrew, Damien turned to Eleanor, his expression thunderous. "You test me," he said lowly, his voice thick with restrained fury. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, though her pulse quickened. "Perhaps I only wish to know if you feel anything at all." The word struck him harder than any accusation. For a heartbeat, his mask slipped, and Eleanor saw the storm beneath, the vulnerability, the desire, the fear. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone, replaced by the iron control she had come to know so well. "You tread on dangerous ground," he warned, his voice rough. "Perhaps danger is the only way to reach you," she whispered back. The exchange left them both shaken. That night, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed. She knew she courted risk. Damien was a man of pride, his temper tightly leashed but fierce when roused. Yet she also knew she could not return to invisibility. The game of jealousy, reckless though it was, had opened a door between them, one that might lead to passion or ruin. Damien, too, wrestled with his thoughts. Alone in his study, he poured a glass of brandy but barely touched it. He saw again the defiance in Eleanor's emerald eyes, the way her voice trembled yet did not break. She was no fragile doll. She was a woman of fire, a woman who demanded to be seen. And against his every vow, against his every instinct, Damien found himself drawn to her flame, even as it threatened to consume him. Theirs had begun as a marriage for appearances, a union forged of necessity and pride. But now, in the shadow of jealousy and defiance, it had become something far more volatile, a dangerous game of hearts where one misstep could shatter them both. The dangerous game between them could not last forever. Every glance across a crowded room, every sharp exchange of words, every moment of silent tension wound tighter and tighter, like a bowstring stretched to the breaking point. And, inevitably, it broke. It happened on a night when summer storms battered London, rain lashing against the stone walls of Aylesford Abbey. The household had retired early, but Damien remained in his study, pacing before the fire, his mind a restless snarl. Eleanor's laughter with Harrow, her bold defiance, her insistence on testing him, they echoed in his head like a relentless refrain. He told himself it was anger, mere irritation at her brazenness, but he knew it was something far more dangerous. He was jealous, and worse, he was afraid. Afraid of how much he wanted her, afraid of how deeply she was slipping past the walls he had sworn to maintain. Eleanor, too, could not sleep. She had grown weary of half measures, of secrets and silence. Tonight, the storm outside seemed to echo the storm inside her. At last, she rose, wrapped herself in a silk robe, and descended the darkened corridors until she found herself before the heavy doors of Damien's study. She hesitated only a moment before pushing them open. He stood at the hearth, his broad shoulders tense, his storm-grey eyes lifting to meet hers with a flash of surprise. "You should be abed," he said, his voice rough, though it lacked conviction. "And you should not pace like a caged beast," she replied softly, closing the door behind her. "Tell me, Damien, what keeps you awake?" The use of his name, rare on her lips, sent a jolt through him. He turned away, staring into the flames. "It is of no consequence." But Eleanor would not relent. She crossed the room slowly, the firelight catching in her auburn hair, her green eyes bright with determination. "You say nothing is of consequence, yet your silence screams louder than words. You burn with jealousy, and still you pretend it is nothing." His jaw clenched. "You mistake me, Eleanor. I am not a man to be moved by petty games." "Games?" Her voice sharpened. "You call it a game that I wish to be seen, that I wish for my husband to look at me as though I matter. If it takes Nathaniel Harrow's attention to stir you, then perhaps you are right. It is a game, but one you are losing." He spun then, his composure shattering like glass. "Enough!" The word thundered through the chamber, his eyes blazing. "Do you think I do not see you? Do you think I do not notice every laugh, every glance, every time you shine in a room that once dismissed you? God help me, Eleanor, I see you more than I wish to." Her breath caught, her heart pounding. "Then why do you deny it? Why do you hide behind this mask of indifference, this vow never to feel?" His hands curled into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling as though he had fought a battle. At last, his voice dropped, raw and unguarded. "Because feeling is dangerous, because love destroys, because once I gave my heart and it was shattered beyond repair. I swore I would never again let anyone hold that power over me, and yet here you stand, tearing down every wall I built." Silence fell, broken only by the roar of thunder outside. Eleanor's eyes softened, though her resolve remained. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but steady. "I am not the one who betrayed you, Damien. Do not punish me for another's sins. I am here. I am your wife, and whether you admit it or not, your heart is already mine." For a long moment he stared at her, every muscle in his body taut with restraint. Then, as though the storm inside him had at last broken free, he crossed the space between them in 2 strides and seized her in his arms. His mouth crashed against hers in a kiss that was equal parts fury and desperation, passion and surrender. Eleanor clung to him, her hands tangling in his dark hair, her body melting into his as the fire roared beside them. The kiss deepened, the storm outside raging in time with the tempest within. When at last they broke apart, breathless, Damien pressed his forehead to hers. "You will undo me," he whispered hoarsely. "Perhaps," she replied, her lips curving faintly. "But perhaps in undoing, you will find yourself again." In that moment, amid thunder and fire, something irrevocable shifted. The cold Duke had yielded, if only for a breath, and Eleanor knew the dangerous game was over. What lay before them now was far more perilous and far more precious. Morning light crept into Aylesford Abbey as though uncertain of its welcome, painting the stone walls in pale gold. Eleanor stirred beneath the silk canopy of her bed, her mind still dizzy from the storm of the night before. She could almost taste Damien's kiss, fierce and consuming, a brand upon her very soul. For a fleeting moment, hope bloomed within her. Hope that at last the barriers had fallen, that her husband had allowed himself to feel. Yet as the day unfolded, reality returned with cruel swiftness. Damien avoided her. At breakfast, his chair at the head of the table sat empty, the servants murmuring that his Grace had left early for the stables. At luncheon, he was nowhere to be found, and by supper, Eleanor sat alone in the cavernous dining hall, her food untouched. The silence was deafening. He had kissed her as though he could not bear to lose her, and now he retreated as though the very act had been a mistake. By the second day, Eleanor's hope soured into fury. Was she to be toyed with, used in a moment of passion, only to be discarded? She thought of his words, "You will undo me," and wondered if he now feared how deeply he had begun to care. But fear was no excuse. She had endured too much to be hidden away once more. On the third evening, she found him in the library. The room was lit only by a single lamp, shadows stretching long across shelves lined with centuries of knowledge. Damien sat in an armchair, a glass of brandy in hand, his gaze fixed on nothing. He looked weary, haunted, as though he had fought a battle no one else could see. Eleanor entered without announcement. "So, this is your answer? Silence?" He startled slightly, then masked it with a sip of brandy. "It is late. You should rest." Her emerald eyes flashed. "Do not dismiss me, Damien. Not after—" She broke off, the memory of his mouth on hers flooding her senses. "Not after what happened between us." His hand tightened around the glass. "What happened was a mistake." The words cut deep, sharper than any blade. Eleanor's breath hitched, but her voice steadied with iron will. "A mistake? You kissed me as though your life depended upon it. You held me as though you could not bear to let go. Was all of that false?" He rose abruptly, striding to the hearth. His broad shoulders were tense, his hands braced against the mantel. "It was weakness, nothing more. I swore I would not feel. And yet you—" He broke off, his voice rough. "You make me forget myself." "Then forget," she said fiercely, stepping closer. "Forget your vows to solitude. Forget the pain that made you build this prison of pride. For once in your life, Damien, stop running from what you feel." He turned then, his storm-grey eyes ablaze. "Do you think it is so simple that I can set aside the past as though it never happened? You know nothing of the cost of love. Then tell me." Her voice rose, echoing through the grand chamber. "Tell me what holds you captive and let me share the burden. Or will you chain yourself to ghosts forever?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and trembling. Damien's chest heaved, his face shadowed with anguish. For a moment, Eleanor thought he would speak, that he would bear the wound festering within him. But at last, he shook his head, his voice low and ragged. "I cannot." The finality in his tone struck her like a blow. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she refused to let him see her break. Straightening her spine, she lifted her chin. Then you are a coward? His eyes widened, fury and hurt flashing in equal measure. But before he could respond, she turned and swept from the room, her footsteps echoing through the abbey's stone corridors. In her chamber, tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. She would not weep for a man too frightened to grasp the gift before him. If Damien Blackwood could not name the truth of what bound them, then she would carve her own path with or without his heart. And yet, deep within her, a quieter voice whispered, "He feels it. He feels it as surely as I do. He only fears the truth." Eleanor lay awake long into the night, her mind torn between anger and longing. Damien, too, found no rest. Alone in the library, he stared into the dying embers of the fire, her words echoing in his soul. Coward. The accusation stung, for it was true. He had faced duels, wars of politics, scandals. But the prospect of love terrified him more than any enemy. The unspoken truth hung between them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. He loved her. And until he could admit it, they would both remain prisoners of silence. London was never kind to scandal, and when scandal struck, it struck like wildfire. Rumours, once a whisper in gilded parlours, soon became the only currency in every drawing room. Eleanor felt it first at Lady Huntington's soirée, where conversations halted the moment she entered. The ladies' fans fluttered like restless wings, and gentlemen glanced sidelong, their smiles edged with cruelty. She carried herself with dignity, her emerald eyes unyielding, yet inside her heart thudded with dread. It had begun with Helena Carroway, the same sharp-tongued widow who had long coveted Damien's attention and despised Eleanor's sudden rise as Duchess. With venom wrapped in silk, Helena spread the tale. That Eleanor had grown far too close to Nathaniel Harrow, that their walks in gardens were more than innocent, that the Duke himself had been cuckolded while society watched. The whispers spread, exaggerated with every telling, until Eleanor's name was paired not with admiration, but with disgrace. Damien learned of it when a letter, unsigned but cruelly detailed, arrived at his desk. At first he dismissed it, but then more letters came, anonymous barbs delivered by cowards emboldened by gossip. Your wife dishonours you. She parades with Harrow. She laughs at your pride. His hands trembled as he crushed the parchment, torn between disbelief and a darker fear. That his refusal to claim Eleanor openly had left her vulnerable to ruin. The breaking point came at the Duke of Pembroke's grand summer masquerade. It was a night meant for spectacle. Glittering masks, endless champagne, 1,000 candles blazing from crystal chandeliers. Eleanor entered with her head high, adorned in a gown of deep sapphire that set her apart like a jewel against velvet shadows. Yet even behind masks she felt the weight of eyes upon her, felt the venomous whispers that slithered through the crowd. Then Helena struck. Masked in silver and feathers, she approached Eleanor with a smile as sweet as poison. "My dear Duchess," she purred loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "How bold of you to attend alone. I had thought Lord Harrow might be at your side, as he so often is." The words cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled, fans snapped shut, heads turned. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she held Helena's gaze, refusing to flinch. "My husband needs no proxy," she said coolly. But Helena only smirked. "And yet does he not? For he is never where you are most admired." The crowd murmured, their appetite for blood whetted. Eleanor stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Then from the far end of the ballroom, a voice rang out, low, commanding, unmistakable. "Enough!" The sea of masks parted as Damien strode forward, tall and unmasked, his storm-grey eyes blazing. He cut through the crowd like a blade, his presence a force that silenced even the cruelest tongues. Coming to Eleanor's side, he offered his arm, his voice carrying for all to hear. "The Duchess of Aylesford attends with me, and let it be known, she is mine, mine in name, in honour, and in heart." A stunned hush fell. Damien's declaration struck harder than any duel could. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and Eleanor, trembling, slipped her hand into his. But Damien was not finished. He turned his gaze upon Helena, his words edged with steel. "If any here doubts her virtue, they answer to me. And as for Harrow, he is my friend, and nothing more to my wife than courtesy allows. Spread another word against her, Lady Carroway, and you will find your welcome in society far less generous." Helena paled beneath her mask, her smirk vanishing. The crowd, once brimming with malice, now shifted, eager to align with power. Murmurs of admiration rose. The Duke defends her. He claims her openly. Perhaps their marriage is stronger than we thought. And then, in a gesture that silenced all doubt, Damien turned to Eleanor, took her gloved hand, and raised it to his lips. His kiss lingered, tender yet defiant, sealing his words with something far more dangerous than pride, with truth. Eleanor's heart thundered. This was no mere act of appearances. His eyes, unguarded, met hers with fire and vulnerability alike. The man who had sworn never to love again had, before all of London, betrayed himself with a single vow. She was his, and he would not let her fall. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling until the great hall shook with it. Eleanor stood beside him, her chin high, her heart alight with something that felt perilously close to triumph. For in that moment, scandal had been transformed into strength. And though Damien had not spoken the word love, his actions had cried it louder than any confession could. The masquerade had ended in thunderous applause, yet the ride back to Aylesford Abbey was wrapped in silence. Eleanor sat rigid in the carriage, her hand resting lightly in Damien's, though neither spoke. The echoes of his public declaration still rang in her ears, mine in name, in honour, and in heart. Bold words meant to silence scandal, and yet when his storm-grey eyes had locked with hers, she had seen something more, truth, raw and unguarded. But truth spoken, under the weight of pride and circumstance, was not the same as truth freely given. She needed more than a performance. She needed his heart. Damien, for his part, felt as though his very soul had been torn open before all of London. He had not planned the words. They had ripped themselves from him, driven by jealousy, fury, and an unshakable need to shield Eleanor from harm. To see Helena humiliated, to watch the crowd bend to his defence, it should have satisfied him. Yet it did not. Instead, a hollow ache gnawed at him, because though he had claimed Eleanor in front of the world, he had still not confessed to her what she most deserved to hear. When the carriage drew up to the Abbey, Eleanor rose first, her sapphire skirts sweeping the steps as she ascended to the great hall without a backward glance. Damien followed, slower, his jaw tight, his mind already at war with itself. He knew he could not retreat into silence this time. Not after all that had been said. Not after all that had been done. Later, in the stillness of her chamber, Eleanor removed her mask and jewels, her fingers trembling. The mirror reflected a woman who had endured humiliation, stood tall through gossip, and witnessed her husband defend her with fire. Yet the mirror also reflected her doubt. Had he spoken from love, or merely from pride, wounded by rumour? She was not a woman to be satisfied with half measures. She would know the truth, whatever it cost. The door creaked, and there he was, Damien, still in his evening coat, his face shadowed by something more dangerous than anger: vulnerability. For a long moment they stared at one another, neither speaking. At last, Eleanor's voice cut the silence. "You silenced the crowd tonight," she said quietly. "But what of me? Am I to remain in silence too?" He stepped closer, his eyes storming. "I silenced them because they dared question you, because they sought to destroy what they could never touch." His voice roughened. "Because I could not bear it." Her chin lifted. "And why could you not bear it, Damien? Because your pride was wounded, because the world might think the Duke of Aylesford less than unassailable." He flinched, as though struck. "Do you truly believe I defended you for pride?" "I do not know what to believe." Her voice trembled, but she did not falter. "One night you kiss me as though your heart burns for me. The next you retreat into shadows. And when the world presses its judgment upon us, you claim me before them all. Yet here, in this room, where it matters most, you give me nothing. Tell me, Damien, was it all for show?" The air between them quivered, heavy with words unspoken. Damien's fists clenched at his sides, his body taut with the effort of restraint. For years he had buried the truth, convinced it was safer to live without love than risk the devastation it could bring. But Eleanor's emerald eyes cut through every defense, demanding the one thing he had sworn never to give. At last, he broke. "No," he said hoarsely, the word tearing from his throat. "It was not for show. It has never been for show. God help me, Eleanor. I love you." Her breath caught, her heart stumbling. He had said it, the word he had sworn to banish, the word she had longed to hear. Yet she needed more. "Say it again," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "Not for them, not for appearances. Say it for me." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, seizing her hands in his. His voice was raw, stripped of every armor. "I love you, Eleanor. I love you as I have never loved before. You have undone me, destroyed every wall I built. You terrify me because you hold the power to break me as no one else ever could. And yet, even knowing that, I would choose you 1,000 times. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed his hands to her heart. "Then let us both be undone. For I love you too, Damien. I loved you even when you tried to push me away, even when you pretended you felt nothing, and I will not let you hide from me again." His mouth found hers then, not with fury as on the stormy night, but with reverence, with surrender. It was not the kiss of a man at war, but of a man who had laid down his arms. When at last they parted, breathless, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "You are my heart, Eleanor. You are my vow, not a vow of silence, but of love." And for the first time, the Duke of Aylesford's heart was no longer his alone. It belonged to her. The days that followed their surrender unfolded like the first light after a storm, fragile, tentative, but full of promise. At Aylesford Abbey, where silence and distance had once reigned, there was now laughter echoing in the halls, the warmth of shared meals, the quiet intimacy of stolen glances. The walls that had divided Damien and Eleanor crumbled, not in a single dramatic collapse, but piece by piece, moment by moment, as they allowed themselves to live, not as strangers bound by duty, but as husband and wife in truth. For Eleanor, the change was almost surreal. She had grown accustomed to solitude, to cold breakfasts and empty evenings, to a husband who spoke little and revealed even less. Now she found Damien waiting for her in the morning room, offering her tea with a shy smile, as though uncertain of his new role. At first, she teased him for his awkwardness, but her heart softened at the effort behind it. This was a man unlearning years of silence, relearning how to share his life. One morning, as summer rain pattered softly against the windows, she found him in the library, not with his usual solitary brandy, but with a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, and a boyish grin tugged at his mouth. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, holding out a volume of poetry. "Byron! You quoted him once at supper." "I remembered." The gesture nearly undid her. He had remembered even when he pretended not to listen. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing, and together they read verses aloud, their voices weaving into the rhythm of the rain. It was a small thing, but to Eleanor it was everything. Proof that he not only heard her but cherished what she offered. Their newfound closeness extended beyond the abbey walls. In society, Damien no longer kept Eleanor at his side as a mere ornament. He kept her there as his equal. At gatherings he introduced her with pride, his hand lingering at her waist, his gaze protective yet tender. The same nobles who once whispered of scandal now whispered of admiration, marvelling at the transformation of the Duke of Aylesford. Eleanor bore it all with grace, though she knew the true transformation was not hers, but his. And yet, for all the sweetness, there remained shadows, not of doubt, but of fear. Eleanor saw it in the way Damien sometimes fell silent after laughter, his eyes clouding as though haunted by ghosts. She knew he carried wounds deeper than any words could mend, scars from a past he had not yet fully revealed. She did not press him, but she held his hand when the shadows came, silently promising that he would never face them alone. One evening, beneath a canopy of stars in the Abbey gardens, Damien broke the silence himself. They walked arm in arm along the gravel path, the night air scented with roses. After a long pause, he said, "I never thought I would have this again. The chance to, feel, to hope. I told myself it was safer not to." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now?" He drew a deep breath. "Now I find myself terrified, because I cannot imagine losing you, and that makes me vulnerable in a way I swore I would never be." She stopped, turning to face him, her emerald eyes shining in the starlight. "Love is not weakness, Damien. It is strength. It gives us something to fight for, something greater than ourselves. Do you not see? You are stronger now than you have ever been." His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "How is it you always know the words I need to hear?" "Because I love you," she whispered simply. He kissed her then, slow and tender, beneath the endless stars. It was a kiss that sealed not a performance, not a pretense, but a partnership. Back within the Abbey, life shifted in countless small ways. Damien invited her counsel on estate matters, listening intently as she suggested improvements for the tenants' welfare. Eleanor, in turn, found joy in discovering his hidden gentleness, the way he greeted stable hands by name, the quiet pride he took in his gardens, the rare but dazzling laughter that erupted when she teased him mercilessly. It was not perfection. They quarrelled still, for both were proud, but even in quarrels there was now a thread of affection, a knowledge that anger would give way to reconciliation. They had become partners, allies, lovers. For Eleanor, it felt as though she had stepped from a painted portrait into a living, breathing life. For Damien, it felt as though he had stepped from a tomb into the light. And so their new beginning was not marked by grand declarations, but by the quiet certainty of two hearts learning to beat in unison. It was the beginning not of appearances, but of truth. For weeks their new beginning blossomed, but London society was not so quick to forget. While many softened toward the Duchess, Not all tongues were silenced. Helena Caraway, humiliated but not defeated, lingered in shadows like a viper waiting for its chance to strike again. And chance came swiftly, for politics and power had always walked hand in hand with gossip. The Duke of Aylesford, respected in Parliament, had recently spoken against a proposed bill that favoured wealthy land barons at the expense of smaller tenants. His stand, though admirable, had made enemies among powerful men. Whispers began to weave together. If Damien's Duchess could be painted as unfaithful, if his household could be destabilized, his political influence might crumble. Helena, ever vengeful, aligned herself with those eager to see the Duke fall. Eleanor first sensed the storm when she received an anonymous note at the Abbey. Written in a fine but unfamiliar hand, it warned, "Your husband is not the only one being watched. Guard your steps, Duchess, for eyes linger where they should not." She dismissed it at first as another petty attempt to rattle her, but soon the pattern grew undeniable. At every gathering, she felt stares linger longer, questions grow bolder, whispers sharpen like knives. One evening at a dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Redford, the trap was sprung. Eleanor had taken her seat when a folded parchment was delivered discreetly by a footman. Her hand trembled as she opened it. Within, she found not words but a sketch, crude yet unmistakable. It depicted a woman with auburn curls in the arms of Nathaniel Harrow. The implication was clear. Gasps rose as the drawing was passed around the table, deliberately planted to humiliate her. Damien's jaw tightened as he saw it, his storm-grey eyes darkening like a gathering tempest. He rose, his chair scraping sharply against the marble floor. With one sweep, he seized the drawing, tore it in two, and flung the pieces into the fire. The entire table fell silent, the flames devouring the slander. "My wife's honour," he said in a voice that carried like a blade, "is not fodder for amusement. Whoever dares defame her again will find themselves my enemy, and I do not forgive my enemies." The company shrank beneath his fury, but the damage was done. Eleanor, cheeks flushed with humiliation, barely touched her food. Later that night in the carriage, she sat stiffly, staring out into the rain. Damien's hand twitched, as though he wished to reach for hers, but pride held him still. At last he spoke. "Do you believe me capable of doubting you, Eleanor?" Her eyes flashed as she turned to him. "It is not your belief that wounds me, Damien. It is that they use me to strike at you. I cannot bear to see you diminished because of me." His hand closed over hers then, firm, steady. "They diminish nothing, do you not see? You are my strength. Without you, they would have found a hollow man to break. With you at my side, they will find me unyielding." She wanted to believe him, and yet the hurt lingered, not in him, but in herself. She had fought so hard for dignity, for respect, and still they tried to strip it from her. The shadows of Helena's malice threatened to undo all the light she and Damien had built together. The test reached its height when Helena herself appeared at a garden party a fortnight later, dressed in crimson silk, her smile venomous. She approached Eleanor with feigned civility, then leaned close enough for only her to hear. "You think him yours now, don't you? But men like Damien tire of pretty trinkets. He defended you because scandal wounded his pride, but love, he has no love to give. He never did." Eleanor's breath caught, her composure wavering. Yet before she could reply, Damien was there, his hand at the small of her back, his gaze fixed coldly on Helena. "Lady Caraway," he said, his tone silk over steel, "you forget yourself. The Duchess is not your rival, for she does not stoop to compete. She is my wife, and the only woman I shall ever love." The words rang with finality, striking Helena as surely as a duel's pistol shot. She faltered, her lips parting in disbelief, before retreating under the weight of his unflinching stare. Around them, guests whispered, but this time the whispers carried not venom but wonder. "The Duke loves his Duchess. He said it. He proclaimed it." Eleanor's heart swelled, her earlier doubts melting away. For Damien had not spoken those words in the privacy of their chambers, nor in the heat of confrontation alone. He had spoken them before society, where pride might once have silenced him. He had chosen her openly, irrevocably. That night, when they returned to the Abbey, Eleanor turned to him in the quiet of their chamber. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. "You said you loved me, Damien, in front of them all. Did you mean it?" He cupped her face, his eyes fierce and unguarded. "Every word, and I will say it 1,000 more, until none dare question it again." And with that, the test was passed. For the Duke had been measured not by power or pride, but by love, and he had not been found wanting. Though society now whispered with admiration instead of disdain, Damien knew there was one final wall standing between them, the wall he himself had built. For all his proclamations of love, for all the tender moments they now shared, he had never told Eleanor the whole truth. Not of the vow he had sworn years ago, nor of the woman whose betrayal had forged it. And unless he did, a part of him would always remain locked away, chained to ghosts of the past. It was Eleanor who pressed the matter, not with demands, but with quiet, steady patience. She sensed it in the way Damien's eyes clouded when joy should have lit them, in the way his hand sometimes tightened on hers, as though he feared she would vanish one evening. As autumn winds whispered through the Abbey's gardens, she finally spoke. "We cannot move forward, Damien," she said softly, her cloak drawn tight against the chill. "Until you stop looking backward. You carry something, a shadow you do not share. Will you not trust me with it?" For a long time he said nothing, his jaw working as though the words themselves were stones too heavy to lift. At last he led her into the old west wing of the Abbey, seldom visited, where dust lay thick upon the draperies and time seemed frozen. He unlocked a chamber and pushed open the door. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of age and memory. It was a lady's chamber, long untouched. A dressing table stood with brushes still scattered, a faded gown draped over a chair, a portrait on the wall of a young woman with raven hair, and a smile bright enough to banish storms. Eleanor felt the weight of it before he spoke. "Her name was Isabella," Damien said, his voice low. "We were engaged. I believed her my salvation, the one who would anchor me after my father's death. I trusted her with everything. But while I bled myself dry restoring these estates, she sought comfort elsewhere, with a man I called my friend." His hands clenched into fists. "The night I discovered them, she laughed." "Laughed, Eleanor, as though my heart were a jest. I swore then that love was nothing but a weapon to destroy fools like me. And so I vowed, never again." He turned from the portrait, his shoulders rigid, but his eyes burned with torment. "Do you see now why I fought you? Why I pushed you away even as you drew me closer? To love you was to risk being broken again, and I could not endure it." Eleanor's heart ached, not from jealousy but from compassion. She crossed the room, laying her hand over his clenched fist until it softened. "You were betrayed, Damien, cruelly and unjustly, but I am not Isabella. I will never laugh at your pain. I will never break your trust. You need not carry her ghost between us any longer." Tears burned in his eyes, though he blinked them fiercely away. "Do you not see? I already gave you that power, Eleanor. The moment you touched my hand at Lady Worthington's ball, the chains began to break, and now I am terrified because I cannot imagine life without you." She lifted his face with gentle hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Then let the chains fall. You are not a prisoner of the past, Damien. You are free, if you choose to be." The storm inside him broke then. He pulled her into his arms, clutching her as though she were the lifeline he had long denied himself. His tears fell into her hair, hot and unguarded, and for the first time in years, Damien Ravenscar, the untouchable Duke, the man of iron and pride, wept, not for weakness, but for release. When he lifted his head, his eyes were clear, the shadows chased away by a light she had never seen before. "I am
free," he whispered, wonder in his tone. "Because of you. Because you loved me when I gave you nothing. Because you stayed when I tried to drive you away." Eleanor smiled through her own tears, her voice steady. "And I will stay always. No vow of yours will drive me away again." He kissed her then, not with desperation, but with peace, a kiss that sealed the breaking of chains that bound them not by fear, but by choice. When they left the chamber, Damien locked it once more, but this time it was not to bury the past, it was to lay it to rest. He no longer needed its shadow to guard him. He had found his light, and her name was Eleanor. Winter came early to Aylesford, the first snow dusting the turrets of the abbey in silver and white. To Eleanor, the season felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, a chance to step into a life no longer bound by performance, but by truth. Since Damien's confession in the long-forgotten chamber, their bond had deepened into something unshakable. The walls that had once divided them were gone, and in their place stood trust, devotion, and a love that had been tested in fire and found indestructible. London society, ever fickle, soon embraced what it had once scorned. The Duke of Aylesford, who for years had stood as a figure of cold authority, now walked into ballrooms with his Duchess at his side, their hands linked with quiet certainty. Whispers of scandal were replaced by murmurs of admiration. Women envied Eleanor, not only her beauty, but the way her husband's gaze softened when it fell upon her. Men respected Damien not just for his wealth or influence, but for the strength it took to admit vulnerability and claim love openly. Their transformation was not merely personal, it shifted the very way others viewed the meaning of marriage. But it was not in London's glittering halls that Eleanor found the truest measure of her new life. It was in the quiet moments of the Abbey, waking to the warmth of Damien's arms around her, strolling through the frost-covered gardens as he pointed out the progress of the tenants' cottages, laughing with him over supper when his usually dry wit broke into rare and delightful humour. These were the threads that wove their days together, ordinary and yet extraordinary in the joy they carried. One evening, a fortnight before Christmas, the Abbey hosted a gathering for their tenants. The great hall, once a place of austere silence, now blazed with firelight and festivity. Children laughed as they danced to fiddles, women clasped Eleanor's hands in gratitude for her kindnesses, and men raised their mugs to the Duke who had fought for their rights. Damien stood among them, not as a distant figure of authority, but as a man who belonged, his hand resting lightly on his wife's waist. At the height of the evening, Eleanor slipped away to the balcony, watching the snow fall softly over the estate. Damien joined her, wrapping his cloak
around her shoulders. For a time, they stood in silence, the night calm and still. Then Eleanor turned to him, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and the falling snow. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the night you told me our marriage was only for appearances? That I was to be your Duchess in name, nothing more? Damien grimaced, shame flickering across his features. A cruel beginning, one I regret more than I can ever say. She touched his cheek gently. And yet, look how far we have come. No performance, no pretenses, only us. He took her hand, pressing it to his lips. You were the bravest of us both, Eleanor. You refused to let me hide behind walls. You forced me to see that love was not my enemy, it was my salvation. Her smile trembled with emotion. And you were brave enough to surrender. That is why we stand here now, free. He drew her close, his voice low, meant for her alone. Then let me vow once more. Not a vow of silence nor of pride, but a vow to love you fiercely and faithfully until my last breath. This, Eleanor, is my true marriage vow. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, and mine is the same. Their kiss beneath the falling snow was not the fiery clash of storm and pride that had once defined them, but the steady, enduring seal of a bond that would not break. It was the kiss of two souls who had fought their battles, broken their chains, and found not just love, but partnership, respect, and peace. In the years that followed, their names would be spoken as one, their legacy not of scandal, but of strength. The Duke and Duchess of Aylesford would be remembered not as husband and wife by convenience, but as lovers who defied the odds, who turned a marriage of appearances into a union of hearts. And on that winter night, as snow blanketed the abbey and laughter filled its halls, Eleanor knew with unshakable certainty that she had found her forever, not in appearances, not in show, but in truth, for at last their true marriage had begun.